Well, 70% of all oysters caught in the United States come from the Gulf Coast. That's why Louisiana oyster farmers are trying to bounce back from year after year of disaster, starting with Hurricane Katrina and ending with the British petroleum oil disaster. What could help is a special oyster hatchery, which could produce nearly 5 billion baby oysters every year.
You're looking at why the oyster industry is important to Louisiana, so people can eat and enjoy them. It's here at the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries Marine Wildlife Lab on Grand Isle where oyster farmers and fishermen get to enjoy that experience firsthand and see the future of Louisiana oyster production.
Because the water's slowing down over a reef, it delivers less food.
Dr. John Supan is the director of the LSU Oyster Hatchery. He's leading oyster fishermen and oyster farmers on the first oyster field day since 2004. A lot has happened to this hatchery over those 8 years, disasters which also took a toll on Louisiana's oyster industry as a whole.
We finally overcome 2 hurricanes, 3 hurricanes, an oil spill, and moving and getting destroyed twice.
Well, the oyster industry is still in recovery.
John Tesvich is the chairman of the Louisiana Oyster Task Force. Like the others here, Tesvich is learning about the new varieties of oysters Supan and his colleagues developed here. Oysters like this triploid. Instead of having 2 sets of chromosomes like wild oysters, triploids have 3 sets of chromosomes. That means they cannot reproduce, but it also means triploid oysters will not shed weight in the summer, so they would remain plump and meaty when wild oysters are small and watery. Supan is also experimenting with ways to grow oysters in suspended cages rather than on a reef.
When you're growing up off the bottom, in suspended in the water, they get more food. And these 2 oysters here were grown that way, and so their meat's in a better condition.
This is something that we weren't able to do because of statute. Now we with the help of the legislature, have allowed that to happen. So as we move forward, oystermen that are interested will be able to invest in this technology and actually grow oysters, aquacultured oysters, on their oyster leases.
That's where this oyster hatchery comes in. By growing algae in these tanks, researchers learn what is the best food for oysters. By placing oysters in special brooding tanks, the hatchery can produce 1 billion oyster larvae a year.
To go from growing oysters on the bottom to growing oysters in the water column and at the surface, there's been bills passed in the legislature to permit this now. We now have a hatchery that can start out producing, helping people make their own seed oysters for this, and now it's just going to be a matter of scale and economy.
When it comes to economy, Supan says it does cost more to grow oysters off the bottom. As for scale, well, this oyster hatchery is not big enough. According to Supan, a commercial hatchery would need to produce about 5 billion oyster larvae a year. Where you would see the difference is here.
I hope to see 2 kinds of oysters or more available at an oyster bar in Louisiana. You have the traditional oysters grown on bottom. You have the oysters that are grown off bottom that are meatier and fatter and plumper, and maybe even triploids as well.
It's a hope Supan, LSU, the LSU Ag Center, and Louisiana Sea Grant have been working toward for 22 years.
So all this is kind of pieces of the puzzle. They're finally starting to come together, and now that we are reestablished here in an operation in this fine facility, I think the sky's the limit.
Dr. John Supan says what may be more important to rebuilding Louisiana's oyster industry than the hatchery is financial support from BP. Carolyn Falgoux says in the 2 years since the disaster, BP has yet to process all of her claims. This is a story we will continue to follow.